was the year the first person walked on the moon. 1969 was the year the Beatles gave their last public performance. The Woodstock concert in August was attended by more than 250,000 people. The US Air Force began secretly bombing Cambodia. HMAS Melbourne collided with an American destroyer, killing 74 sailors. And Richard Nixon was inaugurated as the 37th President of the United States. In 1969, John Gorton was Australia's Prime Minister, leading a Liberal coalition government which had been in power for 20 years. The Liberals under Premier Bob Askin were also in power in New South Wales. Sydney Opera House was still 4 years away from its official opening. Sydney's harbour was lined with wharves and docks, and factories and industries took up the foreshores, none busier than those along Rozelle and Blackwattle Bays in the suburb of Glebe, immediately to the west of the CBD. The old terraces of Glebe were not a fashionable place to live, as Sydney's growing population pursued the Australian dream of a block of land and a house in the outer suburbs. Glebe was decidedly working class, but relatively cheap, and becoming attractive to students and staff at the nearby university. Glebe was also becoming attractive to property developers who saw the opportunity to tear down the old houses and replace them with apartment blocks. It was at this time that Bernard and Kate Smith moved to Glebe and recognised they were surrounded by architectural treasures. Sandra Jobson, a journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald, was one of the first to recognise that in Glebe, the times were a-changing.
I found out that he lived down the street from us in Glebe. And so we had a bit of a chat, and I said, well, do you think we should have a Glebe Society? Because some friends of ours ran the Paddington Society, and we knew that so many good things had come out of having a society for residents.
So in June 1969, a meeting was held at the Glebe Town Hall to form a society that would give a collective voice to residents to monitor the planned development and preservation of Glebe.
And of course, in those days, there were very few people living in Glebe who really cared about the architecture of the area, and we felt that perhaps with Bernard's great knowledge, we could, raise the profile of the architecture of the place.
We were gentrification personified.
Yes. For example, we would take down the Cooper louvers off the front verandas and allow the wrought iron to be painted. And
if we found a house that had been, what do we call it?
We call it ranched.
Ranched. We would have taken every opportunity to point out that it would be much better off if it was brought back to its original state.
The Society published the first edition of its bulletin in July. Its mission was spelled out very succinctly. It would concern itself with problems threatening Glebe as a pleasant place to live.
We started doing the newsletter, and Rob and I mainly wrote it with Bernard putting in what he would like us to put in it, and it was very, very primitive technology. I remember we had to type it on an old typewriter and then Roneo it, which was a machine that was just so primitive. Compared with how one would produce a newsletter today, it was very, very primitive.
We saw the bulletin as the way of communicating with the entire membership of the... By the way, it was growing. Within a year we had 80 members and things like this, so we had to communicate with them in some way or other. And the bulletin was the main way we communicated with them, and hopefully beyond them into the community in general.
The editing of it was actually the least of the jobs. It was just the production that was the demanding bit, because it was free. No one had a computer and cut and paste and printed it out all with a couple of taps of the finger.
By 1971, the Bulletin had become a regular monthly publication. The Society's major concern was the North Western Expressway the state government was planning to cut through the heart of Glebe.
it would have meant, the way they were going to do it, which was a cut and fill process, it would have just sliced Glebe into two and completely destroyed, I suppose you can't say completely, substantially destroyed the whole character of the suburb. And that whole period, 69, 72, 75, was a period of great activism, and I think we believed we could achieve anything.
Vernon Winley is our other loss. When he took over the publications subcommittee a couple of years ago, the Bulletin was a sometime thing, much in need of life. And Vernon took it on. He had gone, and so they're advertising in number 6 for a replacement, and that was me. And my recollection is that the first one that I did was number 7 of 73, which is this one here. And I do remember that because it was a bit exotic because it had photographs in it, and photographs were quite expensive in those days to put into a publication like that. And the text of that was written by Albert Mispel, and that was I have a distinct recollection that he did most of the work and I did some of it rather than the other way around, but he never got any credit for it.
In the 1930s, 1940s, the city was ruled by the giant retailers.
Albert Mispel was a printer by profession, but an activist by inclination. As Vice President of the Society, he played a major role in the protests and demonstrations against the proposed freeways.
I've got a truck over there.
No other way about it, we must advance.
The protesters put themselves in front of the bulldozers ripping down the houses on the freeway route, and at times the clashes with police became violent. The most effective action against the bulldozers was the move by the Builders Labourers Federation to put a green ban on the demolition work.
I think if unions such as the BLF, the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union, and the FED&FA hadn't put bans on the rocks, then the rocks would certainly have been into the ground, as would Woolmerglue, as would Surrey Hills, and as would Glebe today. This expressway would be going on, and I think that those unions who are involved in it have got to get down on that job site and argue the question out with their workers.
It was the height of the Green Band movement, and the union members driving the bulldozers basically didn't have their hearts in it.
There was a feeling that they had a role to play, that workers were not just there as chattels, but they had a role to play. We also argued that we should be building buildings that are socially useful. And I think that's important, that we weren't just saying, stop, stop, stop this. I mean, I suppose hitting upon the idea of calling it green bands as against black bands certainly assisted one of those rare shifts that occur where we could attract more people to it.
It was this part of Glebe that gave its name to the suburb. Here, the 19 hectares of housing owned by the Church of England had become a financial burden. The residents paid low rents and their leases were expiring, so in the early 70s the church decided it couldn't, or wouldn't, pay the costs of necessary repairs. Media reports at the time described the Anglican Church as a slum landlord.
There were people there that had lived there all their lives as their parents had, etc., etc. And so we were particularly concerned that we wouldn't like those wonderful houses in Derwent Street and places like that, to deteriorate. And in this particular regard, a lot of Glebe was saved simply because it was left to decay, but it was left to decay, but it also was saved at the same time.
In 1972, Australia elected a new government, and Gough Whitlam's Minister for Urban and Regional Development, Tom Uren, was a member of a reforming government with big plans for change. One of those plans involved redeveloping the Glebe estate as a pilot scheme for other inner-city suburbs. In April 1974, the Anglican Church sold the estate to the federal government for $17.5 million.
Well, I bought more land than any other man in the history of Australia. I mean, nobody has spent more money purchasing land on behalf of the public than I did under Whitlam and secondly under Hawke. And of course, the saving of the Glebe estate. And also, of course, we set up this inquiry into the national estate. And arising out of that, I then introduced the legislation for the Australian Heritage Commission.
The truth is that while the federal government bought the Glebe estate and therefore just made the critical difference in saving that whole area, they didn't actually get very far in implementing those plans because that was a Whitlam government initiative. So when the Whitlam government was replaced by Fraser, that government had no interest in cities. So basically, for a few years under Fraser, the Glebe project was simply starved of funds. So in a way, the only way in which the work that needed to be done on the Glebe estate was going to happen was if it was sold to the state government, and that's what happened.
We had no idea how well the government was going to do it. And we were critical, not in the bulletin so far as I'm aware, critical of the way the government went about it, but they were absolutely right. The first thing they did was replace all the roofs. Well, we thought that was a good idea. The next thing they did was replace all the fences. And we thought, you've got to have, priorities here. But in fact, it was the best thing they could have done because it gave cohesion to the whole thing. And it started a new cottage industry in doing fence palings.
In his account of his years in government, Gough Whitlam proudly quoted the words of the Royal Australian Planning Institute, describing the Glebe estate as a remarkable symbol of official concern for community values rather than developers' balance sheets. In the early 70s, the Glebe Society was defending the suburb on a number of fronts. Glebe was under the control of the Leichhardt Council, and the council's decision to demolish old houses and replace them with apartment blocks had members out on the streets and causing commotion in council meetings. Aldermen and residents were expelled in rowdy scenes.
At that time, the council was allowing blocks of flats to be built right onto the pavement without any gap between the building and the pavement. And we felt that that was not good for the look of the streetscape. And so we fought against that problem as well.
No, there was an emergency there. The council was allowing the destruction of Glebe.
Yes.
Facilitating the destruction of Glebe.
Leichhardt Council was arguably corrupt, but certainly pro-development, anti-preservation of the suburb, anti-community, and was dominated by real estate agents and developers.
It was a time when the Labor Party was being transformed in the inner city, and there was the old hardcore real workers from the Leichhardt, Glebe, Balmain days, and then there were the new people in Glebe and Leichhardt. And if you went to a Labor Party meeting, there was no need to count the numbers because the two tribes were so different. So all the new Glebe people tended to have long blonde hair or long wavy hair, men and women, and be in bright colours and muumuus and things, whereas the older working class tended to dress up for the meetings, and they might be in suits or severe black dresses, and they were very neat and older, sometimes a little bit bowed or stooped because of their physical labour.
A sworn enemy of the Glebe Society on the Leichhardt Council was Alderman H.J. Foley, who accused Bernard Smith of trying to overthrow the council.
He was just like those old Labor types, genial old bloke. He didn't look like what you might think of as a mafia hitman or something. He was genial and so on, but they were used to having the council in their grip.
Doc Foley was an old doctor who'd been in Glebe for a long, long time, and he'd become very important on Leichhardt Council. And I remember going into his hallway and there was a great hole in the floor. And so I negotiated the hole, carrying my Glebe Society newsletters, and went into his waiting room, where I found that the only place you could sit was on an old bus seat that had been yanked out of the pavement and still had the concrete on underneath it.
Fed up with the council's corruption and its support for developers, 2 Glebe Society members became part of the Campaign for a Better Council and ran for office in the council elections.
It wasn't the official Glebe Society policy because we didn't think we should be a party, but most of the Glebe Society membership supported the CBC. The people that were elected that the CBC supported were very much about opening the council meetings to the general public, about anyone being able to have the council meeting papers, lots of things being discussed in the council meetings.
It would be almost another 10 years before Leichhardt Council adopted a local environment plan that restricted residential development to 2 stories and drew up guidelines for development in the municipality according to the character of each precinct. But soon there was another change in the wind. Leichhardt Council was about to lose control of Glebe.
Frank Sartor, as Lord Mayor, was pushing the idea of the city taking over some of the inner suburbs like Glebe, which of course had been in the City Council in years gone by. And Macquarie Street then sort of figured, well, we'll do something about this. How can we set it up so that we get what we want out of it?
I think people who had been in Glebe when originally, when it was part of the City Council, didn't like what happened, and they thought it was much more locally managed if it was Leichhardt, and that the City Council was only interested in the big end of town.
In 1983, Glebe was formally amalgamated with the City of Sydney under Lord Mayor Frank Sartor. It meant that Glebe could enjoy the benefits of a better funded council, but would lose the more local representation provided by the Leichhardt Council. For the members of the Glebe Society, it was a divisive issue.
What I eventually came up with was the idea that what we've got to do is not talk about whether Frank Sartor is good or whether Leichhardt's good or whether Murray Sheehan would be a better, etc., etc., etc. What we wanted was, we want various things for Glebe. We identified what we thought was important for Glebe, and we said, that's our target. That's what we're going to argue for. We're not going to argue for one personality or another or that type of thing. And I think that managed to, I don't suggest there would have been a split in the Glebe Society, but certainly it was a rather tense sort of a period.
The capacity of the City of Sydney to, let's be blunt, their money, their wealth, meant that you could look forward to much better services being provided by a wealthier and more professional council, and that has in fact proved to be the case.
Under Lord Mayor Clover Moore, the Glebe Society has enjoyed a good relationship with the City Council. The Council has supported many of the Society's initiatives, including the tram mural on Glebe Point Road, the Foreshore Walkway, and the recognition of Glebe's iconic landmarks. One of the Society's greatest supporters was Councillor Robin Kemmis, who lived in Glebe and had a personal interest in the amenity and welfare of the suburb. Her sudden death in 2015 was a great loss to the community. From its earliest days, the Glebe Society looked with concern at the foreshores of Blackwattle and Rozelle Bays. The industries that occupied the waterline were certainly historic, but it wasn't necessarily the type of history the Society wanted to preserve.
There was a debate about whether Sydney Harbour should still be a working harbour, or should it be a nice place to live? And of course, it would have been very nice to have had both things, but it wasn't possible.
Developers saw the potential of the waterfront location and realised that once the old factories and warehouses were demolished, the foreshore would be ripe for the pickings.
main company was called Parks Development. They not only wanted to put up as many what we call three-storey walk-ups wherever they could buy an old house, but their great threat was to the foreshores. They wanted to take control of all the foreshore land.
The earliest things that I can remember going to were talks about the possibility of opening up the waterfront so that you could actually get to it. At that stage, it was even difficult to envisage what a waterfront park, a waterfront walkway would look like, because there were so few places where you could actually see it.
The Glebe Society had a vision and a plan for a foreshore walkway that would run the entire southern and western length of Blackwattle and Rozelle Bays.
Alan Robertson was the driving force there. He no longer lives in Glebe, but he was the one that drew up a plan about how the whole Glebe foreshore could be opened up.
It was not until 1983 that the Blackwattle Bay Park was opened, but the complete foreshore walkway was still only a plan. It was the bicentennial in 1988 that prompted the state government to provide the funds to buy the land between Jubilee Park and Rozelle and build Bicentennial Park and the walkway connecting the two bays.
It can be a little disheartening looking through the bulletins that I edited. One of the early ones in 1994, when I started editing then, was another Bays precinct plan. And the report notes that this was already the third precinct plan, and that was in 1994. And, you know, the Bays precinct is still going through all these mutations and plans.
The Bays precinct continues to be closely watched by the Glebe Society as plans for a new fish market take shape. Of particular concern is the need for traffic and transport management and a priority for affordable housing in any new residential development.
Way back, the Glebe Society was trying to make the foreshores accessible for the public, and they were largely successful in doing that. But there's always this risk that public land will be alienated, and this is what's happening with with Blackwattle Bay and the move of the fish markets, which is on public land, to more public land, and then the state government plans to sell off the fish market site to build, and undoubtedly it will be a large residential development owned by a developer who will make a lot of money. So that's alienating public land. Is that the way we want our public land to be used? No one asked us.
The one thing you can say about the Bays precinct is it's been talked about a lot, it's been written about a lot, and we're still waiting to see the positive outcomes that perhaps we were thinking about 20 years ago, and we still haven't got them.
The heart of Glebe is the road connecting Broadway to Glebe Point. It's 2 kilometres long, and its southern end is the suburb's commercial hub. In the 70s and 80s, its cheap restaurants were popular with students and tourists, but by the 90s, Glebe Point Road had lost some of its charm.
It was generally dirty, generally just an unkempt looking place. Things weren't being repaired.
The Glebe Society joined forces with the Leichhardt Council to start the Glebe Point Road project. Every building along the road was photographed and recommendations made for protection and renovation.
It was our wish list, and immediately the city wished that all the other suburbs had got such a wonderful document, and they proceeded to work through that document and did quite a few of the things in it.
This resulted in a plaza with a refurbished Jubilee fountain commemorating the establishment of the municipality of Glebe in 1859. There was also a memorial to the Indigenous boxer Dave Sands and the renovation of University Hall.
Well, it's like the entrance to Glebe Point Road, isn't it? And there was a whole little island there, And of course, eventually they moved the Dave Sands Memorial there, and also the city marking stone that says this is so far from the centre. So all of those things came together to form like a historical introduction to Glebe. When you turn off Parramatta Road, there it is.
The Glebe Point Road project was completed in 1991, and more recently, Society members, including Ted McEwen and Fiona Campbell, organised an up-to-date photo shoot of the buildings in the original study. Peter Thorogood superimposed the images to produce this comparison.
I feel happy. I give Tim a wave and a Jimmer a smile. Michael's busy selling his flowers, and Mark's calling out, "Sweet Jesus loves you." He's probably been at it for hours. Welcome to Glebe Point Road, where people make you feel like home. You'll never be alone when you walk on Glebe Point Road. Glebe Point Road. The moon's high above Blackwattle Bay as the lights flicker on in the city. When the last of the joggers leave Jubilee Park, I've never seen Glebe look so pretty. Welcome to Glebe Point Road, where people make you feel at home. You'll never be alone when you walk on Glebe Point Road. Glebe Point Road. Glebe Point Road. Glebe Point Road.
From the 1920s, Sydney's working harbour was serviced by a railway goods line that started in Darling Harbour and ran through Pyrmont, Glebe, Rozelle and on to Dulwich Hill. When the wharf terminals closed, the line was no longer used, and seeing an opportunity for adaptive reuse, the Glebe Society proposed the introduction of an extensive light rail service to serve a growing city. In 1974, two members of the Society wrote a paper with a plan of how it might work.
The Glebe Society had a long history with the light rail. The monographs from early on were the genesis of the idea of the light rail. So we had a commitment to light rail in the Society.
For many years there was an ideological opposition within transport in New South Wales to any other form of transport, to light rail. So to have a voice like the Glebe Society continuing to raise that. I mean, we weren't the only ones, but I think we were, again, an early, articulate and principled one.
To give the proposal publicity, the Society organised steam train trips on the old goods line. Hundreds of passengers made the journey, many becoming aware for the first time of its potential for passenger traffic.
Those steam train rides were fantastic, and what a propaganda piece, wonderful.
The message got through to the politicians, with the state government promising an investigation of the possibility of a Glebe rail. And in July 2000, the first tram carrying members of the Society arrived at Glebe Station. The light rail is now a victim of its own success, with severe overcrowding in peak periods. The most obvious change in the landscape of Glebe since the society was formed has been the greening of the suburb. The stark bricks and mortar of the 60s has been softened with the addition of trees, parks and gardens.
You can see that if you go back to the photos that Bernard Smith took in 69 through to the early 70s. It's just astonishing. There are no trees, there are no gardens.
The Society's Garden Committee organised garden and flower competitions in the early 70s and made recommendations to Leichhardt Council about tree planting. And when the council was slow to move, the members stepped in.
There were tree planting little activities. It was often associated with our campaign for more parkland, particularly in the Blackwater Bay Park. I think we went along and planted some trees, just in a general feeling that, hey, you could do this. It's a bit of guerrilla gardening before, that existed as a thing. Not all the spontaneous planting activities were a good idea. The most obvious example is Arcadia, the one that has the fig trees down the centre. And now everybody who lives there complains about how dark it is in their house and they've got to have the lights on during the day.
There was a downside to the planting of tall trees throughout the suburb when the replacement of smaller shrubs robbed small birds of their natural habitat. Edged out by larger birds and prey to domestic cats, birds like the blue wren were seen only rarely. The Society, with the help of the City Council, began a project to research and map sightings of blue wrens and to recommend conservation techniques. There are now a number of volunteer bush care groups working in Glebe's parks.
At the beginning, it was all parks and gardens, and then there was the bays and foreshores and those, proposals for parks. There were things about trees, and then gradually the idea of the environment, as we talk about it today, evolved.
For members of the Society in the early 80s, environmental pollution was not an abstract concept. The nearby coal-fired power stations at White Bay and Pyrmont were not just adding to greenhouse gases. What came out of their chimneys was far more tangible.
They used to switch it on every so often and then all the clothes on the line would get black. The future of various power stations was still in doubt, and when occasionally they switched it on, it was not very nice. There was sort of soot falling, and if someone had a load of washing out, they were not very pleased.
From its early days, the Society organised a variety of social events which were popular with members. There were coffee mornings, wine bottling evenings, theatre parties, and an annual ferry trip.
They were fun. It was great. It was sort of locating Glebe in the harbour. And of course, people were still pretty young, had families, wanted to go on young families, those sort of things.
Another popular social event was an open house day when members visited the suburb's historical houses and gardens. It was a time when everyone had a keen interest in renovating old properties and drawing inspiration from their neighbours.
We had house inspections each year and they were very popular initially. The National Trust used to come along. They'd come along by the busload and open up a number of houses, and some of them were grand houses. I can remember Toxteth Lodge was opened once by the nuns, and you could actually go in and go up the tower.
That was a great activity because everyone wanted to see what everyone else had done in their houses, and so you always had a great range of different sort of houses, if you could, from the grand ones down to simple ones. And then a member of the Glebe Society, the people would go away and you'd take over their houses, and then people would buy tickets and come round from house to house. That was a terrific activity. Everyone seemed to be talking about renovation. Even people in flats like me were sort of going to garage sales all around the place and trying to make it look nice and have the right historic colours. And books were coming out like renovating old houses or homes. And so it was a period when everybody was interested in renovation, and almost everyone was a renovation bore.
You've got to remember how decrepit the houses were that people moved into. So the idea of what you might do with a rundown inner city house was of great interest to new people who were moving into the area. So the house inspection idea, linked people together to say, you could do, this is what we've done.
In recent years, the Society has reintroduced house inspections, and there have been well-attended occasions for members to socialise and admire the style of the suburb's houses. By the 1860s, Glebe had become a desirable address, with a number of grand and elegant mansions. Among them was Delwood, the home of architect Michael Golden; Kilford Lodge, owned by soap manufacturer Richard Wilkinson; and Maryville, home of Richard O'Connor, town clerk of the City Council. All of them had been demolished by the 1960s. Lyndhurst was built in 1837 for colonial surgeon John Bowman, and 130 years later it was still standing, but neglected and threatened by demolition. The Glebe Society played an active role in saving Lyndhurst and other iconic buildings, like Bellevue on Glebe Point, Benledi on Glebe Point Road, and Bajura, the home of architect Edmund Blackett. But conserving Glebe's built environment has not been without controversy. Residents have different views about plans to demolish the Metropolitan Remand Centre at the rear of Bajura.
I think in the early years when we came to Glebe and the Remand Centre was built, Glebe used to get regularly, and the Remand Centre got regularly reported on the news because the kids that were on remand there could escape so easily, and they'd be on the town, So it was, 5 children in the remand centre who have, escaped, and of course they'd be back 2 days later after they'd, got drunk or whatever it was they wanted to do in the big city. So fit for purpose it never was.
It was controversial actually as an issue within the Society, and was also of great interest to our Facebook followers, was the demolition of the Remand Centre at Bajura. In the Society there was views were polarised. Some people wanted to keep the brutalist Remand Centre as a heritage architecture, and other people just said it's an eyesore, it needs to be knocked down. So when the appropriate legal body, court, said that it could be demolished, we shared that on Facebook, and about 1,500 people looked at that and shared it with friends, etc. So that was a great way to communicate that.
The Glebe Society logo highlights its priorities, but from time to time, the Society has been criticised for putting environment and heritage ahead of community.
The reason it's an unfair criticism is that the Society has always concerned itself with the other end of Glebe, and one of the main campaigns that the Society took on from the very beginning was to save the Glebe estate, which was a huge thing which many people have spoken about. And that wasn't just to protect the old workers' cottages for their heritage purposes. Going back and looking through the previous bulletins and other things I've read recently, I realised that the idea was to help those vulnerable people that are living in those houses, and to keep Glebe a diverse society, because diversity is good for everybody.
In 2012, the Society hosted the launch of an annual fundraiser for the Centipede After Hours Care Centre at Glebe Public School. The event has been a continuing success, providing an opportunity for members to make a substantial financial contribution to this important community centre. Another Society initiative has been providing essential eating and cooking equipment for those who move from supported accommodation into independent living. The kitchen starter packs have been well received by residents moving out of Elsie and Rainbow Lodge.
I was thinking that Janice Challoner and people of recent years have done a hell of a lot more on the social side of things than ever before. But when you look back through the bulletins, there was an awful lot going on, wasn't there?
Back in the 70s, one of the community activities organised by the Society was caring for boys who had ended up in Royalston, the grand home on Glebe Point Road, which was an institution for children moving between foster care and court appointments.
We'd take them out on the harbour and go to Clark Island and let them have a run around and a picnic and all that sort of thing. And you'd be allocated a couple of kids and they were yours for the day. Yeah. Which was really, really sad, because around about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, these kids would gravitate in to you. It was a bit like a planetary system. They'd get closer and closer and closer and closer because they wanted you to take them home.
Historically, Glebe has always been, socially divided. There are Max Solling tells stories about the responses to the referendum on late night closure, for pubs, whenever that was, late 50s, 60s. And, the people in the southern end of Glebe opposed it, and the people in the northern end, the wowsers, supported it. And similarly, of course, the referendum on conscription during the First World War was supported by the northern end of Glebe, and of course opposed by the people who actually went to war. Let's face it. So it's always, I think, a challenge to question your own self-interest in terms of the things that you take on. But I do think that the main achievements of the Glebe Society have not, in fact, been at the expense of the broader society, but in fact supporting it.
Over 50 years of publication, the Glebe Society Bulletin has had 14 editors. It's a time-consuming job, and in the early days, it was made much more labour-intensive by the technology.
We had a big, I guess it would have been about an A3 cardboard template, and we'd get the copy in from anybody on any old typeface on a typewriter. We'd cut it up and stick it to the template with rubber solution, and then we go over the edges with Tipex to get rid of the black shadows, and then off it would go to the printer. And then we get it back again and rip it all off and start again the following month.
If you look at some of the old ones, the articles are all slightly at an angle and so on. That's from the gluing technique. So the whole process from start to finish took most of 3 weeks, and then it was on you again. So that's why there was a fairly high turnover of editors, I think.
We have been known to paste single letters to correct spelling mistakes. We have virtually no photographs, and I used a book of old advertising material just to put pictures into it.
I don't mean to imply that it was terrible and we were, hated it, because we'd sit in our living room or Albert's living room or something and do it in 2 or 3 or 4 people and drink coffee and probably red wine while we did it and sort of talk about everything under the sun.
I was always doing it at the last minute. So I was always doing it on the night before it had to go to the printer in the morning. And there was no way I could get myself to actually finish it earlier.
From a primitive one-page newsletter, the Bulletin has blossomed into a sophisticated journal, sometimes 20 pages long, and now in colour.
I look now at the old copies and cringe.
In those days, there were still floppy disks. Isn't it sweet? How last century is that? Floppy disks.
I couldn't do anything that would, strictly speaking, classify as desktop publishing. I was just, laying it. I thought I was quite clever to be able to put something in 2 columns, to be perfectly frank.
I didn't want to make big changes, but there were changes I made straight up that weren't so much improving efficiency, but more the aesthetics of it. I was concerned that the font was too small, and I knew that a lot of our members were older people, and if I was struggling with it, then I'm sure other people would be struggling with it as well.
Creative artwork overcame the difficulty and expense of reproducing photos in the early editions. There was readaptive use of cartoons that had appeared elsewhere, and editors made their own artistic contributions.
Every so often I would generally do a heading, and we used to do a lot of stuff about train trips and light rail promotion, and I did this marvellous little engine with a couple of carriages behind it, which you've probably seen in there. And every time we reused that, we'd use it from the previous bullet and cut it out and stick it in, so it got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
Occasionally, letters to the editor of the Bulletin would provoke a lively exchange of correspondence. In 1974, the construction of a memorial in Wentworth Park to the retiring Premier Sir Robert Askin was greeted with hostility and derision by the Glebe Society. An anonymous reader from St Ives wrote condemning the Society's small-minded and parochial attack. In the following edition, another reader responded, tongue-in-cheek, that the memorial was something to be proud of, and hoped that exercising greyhounds might claim it for their very own.
I guess if there is one outstanding thing about looking back over old bulletins is the old, how much changes and how much stays the same.
One thing that hasn't stayed the same is the Society's embrace of social media. In 2001, the website was launched, described by the Bulletin as an avenue to the potential of cyberspace. A Facebook page followed, enabling more timely communication with members and an opportunity for the exchange of opinions.
We have virtually 1,000 followers on Facebook, and so about 900 people see our posts on their Facebook feed. Now that's a lot of people, and that's twice the number of the membership. And the vast majority, I would say, are not members of the Society.
The Bulletin in colour is now available on the website, prompting a debate about the need to continue publishing a hard copy.
One of the things there was this feeling that, we shouldn't email the Bulletin out because people won't pay their subscriptions because they'll get the Bulletin free online and they won't have to join the Glebe Society. And, the organisation is going to go broke if you mail the Bulletin out.
There is something about having hard copies which is irreplaceable. It's like having books on your bookshelf rather than having an e-book.
The monthly publication of the Bulletin is eagerly awaited by members. For the editor, it's a big workload and a challenge to grab the attention of the community's power brokers.
I'm not a great wordsmith, but I do try to think of headlines that are eye-catching, for starters, and also that make our point. I imagine that there's someone in the state government just casting their eye over the front page of the Bulletin and seeing that headline go, oh, we've got a problem.
The Bulletin has reported both the major and minor events in the Society's history, and its photo collection records some memorable moments. The Society still includes some founding members who have seen dramatic changes in the suburb they lived in 50 years ago. On the occasion of its Golden Jubilee, the Society's early bulletins are a reminder that its work is not yet finished.
So the big threat of swathes of demolition had gone, but the threats, of course, as long as there are developers and as long as there are councils that are open to influence.
I think there'll always be a battle to fight, and the Glebe Society is it exists and well equipped to rustle up interest in protesters and tell people what's at risk. So there'll always be battles.
The need is still there, I think, for community to be represented. And while we've got Lord Mayors that sort of say the Glebe Society's doing a marvellous job, done a marvellous job, and praising it as an example for community action groups to follow, I think that the need will be recognised, and hopefully people will be there to sort of do what's got to be done.